Reapportionment, Module 3. Module 3, the rest of the apportionment. In Module 2, we discussed the Standard Form 132, or Apportionment Reapportionment Schedule. But there's more to the apportionment than just the SF-132. The apportionment is made up of the SF-132 and what I refer to as the rest of the apportionment. In this module, we're going to discuss what makes up the rest of the apportionment. In addition, we'll talk about circumstances that affect whether you need to submit an apportionment at all. The rest of the apportionment is included in the Excel workbook as worksheets or tabs. Most of these tabs are system generated by the OMB apportionment system. We've already talked about the first tab, the apportionment request to OMB. That's the SF-132 we spent Module 2 discussing. The next three tabs are the Footnote tabs, one for OMB footnotes, agency footnotes, and previously approved footnotes. The fifth tab is the Approval Info tab. As described in section 120.39, the Approval Info tab shows the name, title, and digital signature imprint of the OMB official who approved the apportionment, as well as other pertinent information. This tab is generated only by OMB during the approval process and would not be added in the development of the apportionment. There may also be some tabs generated for reports, like Apportionment versus SF-133 report, non-expenditure transfers, and warrants, for example. Though these are automatically generated, they are not required to be submitted with the apportionment package. All these tabs are system generated, but there are also tabs developed by the organization submitting the apportionment as supporting documentation. Since these are optional, there are a variety of names. They may be called Financial Plan, Master Table, Summary by Category, Anticipated Reimbursements, etc. Or they may just be called Sheet 2, Sheet 3, and so on. Let's start with the footnotes. Footnotes have become an important part of the apportionment, so much so that they now have their own protocol for presentation. I want to first go through the somewhat nitpicky protocol for apportionment footnotes, and then I'll describe the different types of footnotes we have. Recall when we discussed the SF-132 that there were footnote indicator columns for previously approved amounts, agency request, and OMB action. The footnotes themselves appear as textual descriptions on three separate footnote tabs in the apportionment file. These are generated by the OMB Max apportionment system, one for OMB footnotes, one for agency footnotes, and one for previously approved footnotes. Footnotes are divided into two basic groups, A footnotes and B footnotes. A footnotes are identifiable by an uppercase A followed by a number. For example, A1, A2, and so forth. These appear on apportioned amounts in the Application of Budgetary Resources section on lines from 6001 to 6190. Footnotes on line 6190, total budgetary resources available, are applicable to all apportioned funds. A footnotes have legal effect, which means they are subject to the Anti-Deficiency Act. B footnotes are identifiable by an uppercase B followed by a number, for example, B1, B2, and so forth. These appear on budgetary resources lines from 1000 to 1920. Footnotes on line 1920 refer to all budgetary resources lines. B footnotes merely provide information, so they have no legal effect. About 70% of HHS apportionment footnotes are A footnotes, 30% are B. So, let's take a look at a footnote tab. The OMB apportionment system automatically generates the previously approved and agency request footnote tabs when the initial template is created. The OMB footnote sheet is added once the template is filled in and validated. The sample on the screen is the OMB Footnote Tab. When the template is initially created, any OMB footnotes from a previously approved apportionment in the same fiscal year will be represented on the previous approved footnote tab. If you're creating the first apportionment for a fiscal year, the page will be created but without any data. It's very important that you coordinate the footnotes in the columns on the SF-132 with the footnote numbers and text on the footnote tabs. For example, if you have footnote number A1 in the OMB footnote column on the SF-132, make sure there's a corresponding footnote number A1 in text on the OMB footnote tab, and vice versa. There are several very nitpicky details to remember. Footnote indicators that appear on the SF-132, such as A1, A2, or B1, B2, should be in column A of the appropriate footnote tab, one indicator per cell. Footnote text should be in column B and in a single cell. Make sure there's always text if there's a footnote number. Only one footnote per row is permitted. Footnotes beginning with A should appear under the Footnotes for Apportioned Amounts header, and this group should precede footnotes beginning with B. Footnotes beginning with B should appear under the Footnotes for Budgetary Resources header, and this group should always follow footnotes beginning with A. Do not put any other information on the footnote tabs. These may seem like nitpicky details, but the OMB apportionment system has to be able to read and validate the footnote information, so it's necessary that you follow the rules carefully. So, what footnotes are required to be on an apportionment? Section 120.37 of A11 points out that there really is no universal requirement to include footnotes on an apportionment. There are some guidelines, however, so let's go over them. If OMB included footnotes in the OMB Footnotes tab of the last approved apportionment, you must include these footnotes in a subsequent action in the previous approved column. The system helps with this. For reapportionments during the year, the OMB footnotes are automatically copied from the previous apportionment's OMB Footnotes tab to the current request's previous approved tab. Of course, the first apportionment of the year will have a blank previous approved footnote tab, since there would be no previous action. If a TAFS has a standard footnote year after year, you should retain it in your request, unless you've gotten OMB permission in advance to delete it. Although A11 says you should include any footnotes that OMB has directed you to include, you probably won't have to worry about this because OMB normally just adds the footnote on the apportionment themselves without bothering to direct us to do it. If amounts have been automatically apportioned, something we'll cover later in this module, and there's a subsequent need to reapportion, you should show the automatically apportioned amounts in the previously approved column and add a footnote to indicate that the funds were automatically apportioned. In addition to these examples, OMB recommends in section 120.38 of Circular A11 that agencies may footnote apportionments for annual and or multi-year tasks if funds may be needed to liquidate canceled obligations. This is the proposed footnote. Pursuant to 31 U.S.C. 1553b, not to exceed 1% of the total appropriations for this account is apportioned for the purpose of paying legitimate obligations related to canceled appropriations. We'll discuss this in a bit more detail shortly when I talk about flexibility footnotes. So, as you can see, there aren't that many hard and fast rules in A11 about which footnotes should be included. So, what are the different categories of footnotes? I've identified basically 5 types. Those that provide information, those that provide flexibility, those that place additional conditions on the availability of funds, those that request information, and those that communicate an OMB policy or direction. Let's go over each one in turn. Footnotes that provide information. Footnotes that provide information are B footnotes on the budgetary resources or 1,000 lines. These have no legal effect. They merely provide information. The most prevalent informational footnotes probably the one that provides the public law or laws that provide funding to the account. You may think this would be redundant since this information is asked for in the header, funds provided by public law, blah, 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 and you would be right. But sometimes redundancy adds clarity. Sometimes informational footnotes provide more information about the amounts that make up an entry on a line. For example, here HRSA uses a B footnote to explain how transfers will be used, and here to identify a sequestered amount. Footnotes that provide flexibility. Providing flexibility is probably the type of footnote that is most helpful to us, since this type of footnote allows budget offices to do something that might otherwise be disallowed in its absence. Since the purpose of the footnote is to provide flexibility in how much we can obligate, these footnotes are A footnotes that apply to the application of budgetary resources. Let's talk about 3 of the most prevalent flexibility footnotes. The most prevalent flexibility footnote used is the details on attachments that are not subject to 31 U.S.C. 1517 footnote. This one is so important it appears on most HHS apportionments. Why is that? Because Section 120.36 of A11 states that without such a footnote, all attachments transmitted to the agency that are cited in the apportionment become part of the apportionment and are subject to the Anti-Deficiency Act, including footnotes in the application of budgetary resources section. That would mean that any number or any amount in the supporting documentation could be binding by default. In order to avoid implementing controls for details in supporting documentation, a flexibility footnote should be added to all apportionments with supporting documentation that states details on attachments are not subject to 31 U.S.C. 1517, or this attachment is not subject to 31 U.S.C. 1517. Why is 31 U.S.C. 1517 cited? Recall from Module 1 that this is the section of the Anti-Deficiency Act that makes exceeding the apportionment a violation. So, this footnote exempting backup sheets from the Anti-Deficiency Act provides flexibility to the budget office that has to implement fund control. This is a very important footnote that occurs in virtually every apportionment containing supplementary materials with amounts in them. If you have supporting documentation amounts relating to the SF-132, you should use this footnote. And since this flexibility applies to all apportioned amounts, it should be on line 6190. The second flexibility footnote has already come up. It's the footnote that provides permission to pay bills out of current resources that are related to canceled obligations. Recall that OMB actually recommends in section 120.38 that we apply this footnote to annual and/or multi-year tasks if funds may be needed to liquidate canceled obligations. It says, pursuant to 31 U.S.C. 1553b, not to exceed 1% of the total appropriations for this account is apportioned for the purpose of paying legitimate obligations related to canceled appropriations. The reference to 31 U.S.C. 1553b is the portion of Title 31 that permits current resources to be used to pay for bills that arrive after the account from which the original obligation was made is closed. Normally, an agency cannot use current year funds to pay a bill from another fiscal year. This would violate the bona fide need rule that requires all obligations to be made only for a legitimate or bona fide need of the fiscal year for which the funds were appropriated and no others. So this footnote provides an exception to the bona fide need rule. Any TAFs available for a definite period of time, which would include annual and multi-year TAFs, and which have appropriations that have been canceled, should have this footnote. Conversely, no-year accounts and those that are too new to have canceled balances would not need the footnote. Accounts that need to increase resources frequently, such as offsetting collections or recoveries, often use another flexibility footnote. This third flexibility footnote allows agencies to increase their spending authority from offsetting collections or recoveries without resubmitting an apportionment. Here's a typical sample from a Food and Drug Administration apportionment. The total amount apportioned may be increased for additional spending authority from offsetting collections received by an amount not to exceed 10% of the sum of such amounts identified in the calculation of total budgetary resources available. The amount of such increase is to be applied to the appropriate line in the application of budgetary resources. This footnote expands the authority in section 120.49 of A11, which we'll discuss a bit later. If this authority is used, it's important to remember to indicate that such adjustment authority exists by entering yes in the line split for adjustment authority that we discussed in Module 2. Footnotes that place additional conditions. The third type of footnote places additional conditions on the availability of funds. While information footnotes are fairly benign and flexibility footnotes are usually very helpful, footnotes that place additional conditions can be a pain in the neck and something you need to pay special attention to. Here's a typical sample. Note this example states, funds are available for obligation 10 days after submission of a FY 2017 operating plan to Congress that indicates the planned uses for these funds. The footnote is on every Category B line, so no funds can be obligated until this condition is met. These footnotes are typically used when some information OMB wants is missing from an apportionment or is not available yet. On the plus side, once the condition is met, like submitting an operating plan and waiting the requisite number of days, the funds become available without having to resubmit an apportionment. Note that conditional footnotes are A footnotes and therefore have legal effect. It's important to remember that funding held up by conditional footnotes must be restricted in the accounting system That is, these funds should not be made available until the condition is met. Footnotes that request information. The fourth type of footnote is the information request by OMB. In contrast to B footnotes that we may add to apportionments containing information about resources, these information requests usually appear as A footnotes when OMB uses the footnote to ask for a report or for information. The sample on the screen is a footnote on the Vaccines for Children apportionment, asking for a quarterly report on VFC obligations by year and antigen type. Notwithstanding the classification as an A footnote, it's not clear how such footnotes would have legal effect. It's difficult to imagine what Anti-Deficiency Act provision an agency would be violating if they failed to submit a report to OMB on time. That thought brings us to the fifth type of footnote. Footnotes in which OMB communicates some sort of policy or direction. These footnotes are relatively rare. In the example on the screen, OMB is imparting their policy that they are to be informed in advance of waivers that may cost the government more money. Note that this footnote refers to a policy letter dated March 31st, 1984. This footnote is also applied as an A footnote, indicating OMB's intent is that it have legal effect. In wrapping up the footnotes section of the rest of the apportionment, let me list a few things to keep in mind concerning footnotes. If you have conditional footnotes, it's very important that you use the accounting system to limit amounts controlled by them. Be sure you do not allot and allow conditionally available funds until you know the condition has been met, which may include a waiting period after notification to OMB. You should monitor the status of these conditional apportionments, and when the condition has been fulfilled, make sure the footnote's no longer included in a subsequent apportionment request. Of course, you'll need to explain why the footnote's no longer needed. If the conditions haven't been met, find out when the conditions might be fulfilled and whether the footnote needs to continue. Again, this will need to be explained in your documentation. It's very important that the apportionment preparer and reviewer stay on top of conditional footnotes. Okay, let's go back to the rest of the apportionment tabs. We have covered the apportionment request and the footnotes. We indicated the Approval Info tab reflected the OMB digital signature and approval of the request. And we mentioned some reports that get generated. But this information is automatically generated. What else is needed to make a complete apportionment package that can be added by the preparer? Well, there's a lot of variety here. Since these additional tabs are not system generated, you may add tabs like Financial Plan, or Sheet 2, Sheet 3, Sheet 4. Or you may identify information like a master table, summary by category, anticipated reimbursements, and so on. What you submit depends on what it takes to get an approved apportionment as quickly as possible. Some information is requested by HHS or OMB examiners. Some is submitted in anticipation of answering any questions that may arise concerning the request to save time. Given this fluid situation, here are some thoughts in the for what it's worth department. First of all, keep in mind there are two ways to submit supporting information: as a tab in the apportionment file, which as part of the file accompanies the request to OMB, and separately through workflow, which does not typically accompany the apportionment to OMB. So, let's start with supporting information that accompanies the apportionment. I recommend that you include at least one sheet in the apportionment package to explain why you are submitting the apportionment. This should be obvious. The better you explain why the apportionment needs to be approved, the less time the reviewer and approver needs to take to move it forward. Always include at least a sentence or two, or more if needed, to say why you need to have the apportionment approved. It may be simply to reflect amounts appropriated in public law, or to reflect an increase of Y in amounts previously estimated, or to reflect an increase in offsetting collections, or maybe something more complicated. Whatever the reason, state it as succinctly and informatively as you can in your supporting documentation. Let's look at a sample. This example from NIH provides lots of good information about the request. The public law authorizing the transfer of funds to the account from the Cures Special Fund, an explanation of the change in unobligated balances and recoveries, and authorizing information about the breast cancer stamp collections that are also included in the request. In this CDC example, notice it tells us why the apportionment was sent to request new budget authority and reflect anticipated offsetting collections, as well as update the memorandum obligations column. In this example of a HRSA reapportionment, it explains that funds are being moved from the fourth quarter to the third quarter for health center grant continuation actions. When you're submitting a reapportionment, be sure you don't merely copy the previous explanation. Once an explanation has been used to justify a request, you don't need to repeat it. It just confuses the person reviewing the request. Make sure you focus on what has changed. If appropriate, include a table that shows the change from the previous action. Sometimes a simple table can capture the essence of the change better than words. This doesn't give you permission to skip the textual explanation. The best thing to do is say it and show it. Note the example on the screen. You can see at a glance which activities were increased, which were decreased, and that there's no total effect on total resources. This is a good example of an explanatory table. What other types of supporting documentation might be helpful? Well, many apportionments have some sort of financial plan attached as supporting documentation. In these cases, it's important to ensure what may seem obvious. Make sure the amounts on the tables, where appropriate, agree with the amounts on the SF-132. For example, total resources should match. Category A quarterly amounts should match. Specific Category B items, and so forth. In this Office of Inspector General example, we can see total resources match the apportionment. The appropriation of $80 million matches. A reimbursable agreement with CMS under the Affordable Care Act is properly identified as mandatory, and that the total spending authority from offsetting collections on line 1700, 1701, 1740, and 1840 equals the total reimbursement line of $21 million in the supporting documentation. These are, of course, just a few examples of supporting pages that could appear on your apportionment. There are many others. Keep in mind that your HHS and OMB examiners may request other supporting documentation. What kind of information should accompany the apportionment package in workflow? Examples include appropriation language to help staff identify proper citations for Treasury warrant requests, copies of SF-133s, a list of TAFs involved in non-expenditure transfers, and for accounts with multiple TAFs, a table mapping amounts and appropriations to the appropriate TAFs. So let's start with the appropriation language citation. For appropriations made in permanent law, apportionment supporting documentation should include citations of the source of the appropriations. This is especially helpful since the Budget Office has to request Treasury warrants for these appropriations and needs to know the funding citation. Let's look at a few examples. Here is an example of the citation for foster care permanent appropriations. The first example is the citation for the advance appropriation from the previous year's Appropriation Act. And the second example is a permanent appropriation made in the 110th Congress. Having this information makes it much easier to prepare warrant requests to send to Treasury. These examples are relatively simple, but others can be more complicated by subsequent amendment or amendments, and the citation may need to include all pertinent references to get the full picture. In this example from the Social Services Block Grant Apportionment, we note that $85 million was originally appropriated in the Affordable Care Act for each year of fiscal years 2010 through 2014. But since 2014 has passed, we need to add amending legislation, which at that time extended the appropriation through 2017. In such cases, it's frequently more advantageous to use the U.S. Code citation. In this example, we see that the $85 million has been extended through 2019. The full U.S. Code citation is typically cited in the amending legislation. Here's another example of extensions of appropriations. This is the initial appropriation of the Maternal, Infant, and Early Childhood Program in the Affordable Care Act. If you were preparing an apportionment for 2017, you would need to add amending language from PL 11410 or simply use the U.S. Code citation at 42 U.S.C. 711J. This is an example of backup information that provides a list of TAFs involved in non-expenditure transfers. This information is especially useful when doing max data entry in preparation for the President's budget. For example, this shows the Secretary's 1% transfers to the Refugee and Entrant Assistance account. Here's an example of a table mapping amounts and appropriations to the appropriate TAFs. This type of table is especially helpful when lump sum appropriation language makes funding available to different availability TAFs. Here, for example, we see the total appropriation for the Indian Health Services account, and the table shows how the language allocates the amount by TAFs to the annual account and the no-year account. Here are some things to keep in mind about the rest of the apportionment. The 3 footnote tabs are automatically generated by the OMB apportionment system. There are particularly nitpicky rules for these tabs that you should keep in mind. Keep an eye on these footnotes. Be sure and implement fund controls when necessary, and update or suggest removal of them if warranted. The Approval Info tab is generated only by OMB and should never be included in a request. Use your other optional supporting documentation to make the case that OMB should sign the apportionment request. There's a lot of flexibility in providing this information, which varies from account to account and examiner to examiner. Okay, We've spent a fair amount of time discussing ways to support an apportionment request. But there are situations when the submission of a new apportionment wouldn't be necessary at all. So let's take a few minutes to discuss what types of changes are automatically apportioned without any action on our part. Omb discusses such circumstances in section 120.49 under the heading, "What adjustments can I make without submitting a reapportionment request?" For example, after the first apportionment in a fiscal year, any subsequent downward adjustments do not normally need to be reapportioned. This might include estimated carryover, transfers out, and so forth. Of course, if you have to redo the apportionment for some other reason, you would then include any adjustments made under this and any of the following policies. There are several examples where you can increase amounts up to $400,000 or 2% of budgetary resources, whichever is less, without reapportionment. These include increases in unobligated balances brought forward, increases in budget authority transfers, increases in anticipated appropriations, offsetting collections and recoveries, and in credit accounts, increases in interest payments to Treasury. But there's a catch. When applying the increased resources to the application of budgetary resources section of the apportionment, there are certain limits. First, if you have both Category A and B funds, this authority does not apply. Second, if funds are apportioned in Category B, you can only adjust a single Category B item. This automatic authority does not apply to multiple Category B lines. Third, if your funds are apportioned in Category A, you may only apply the increase to the period during which the increase was realized. For example, if anticipated collections were apportioned in the third quarter, but the increased amount above the anticipated collections, still within the total of $400,000 or 2%, was not realized until the fourth quarter, record the resource in the fourth quarter, not the third. Let's take a look at some examples. In this example, there's only one Category B amount, so it would be okay to automatically adjust this amount upward using the Section 120.49 authority. However, in this example, there are two categories, so the authority could not be used. You would have to resubmit an apportionment. In this example, with funds apportioned only in Category A, you could use the automatic authority to adjust the increase in resources in the quarter these were realized. But in this example, with both Category A and B funds, the Section 120.49 adjustment authority could not be used. To reiterate, if the increase affects more than one Category B line, or if the increase affects the combination of Category A and Category B amounts, you'll have to resubmit a reapportionment. Well, what other adjustments can be requested without submitting a new apportionment request? In our earlier discussion of flexibility footnotes, I mentioned that accounts that need to increase resources frequently, such as offsetting collections or recoveries, often use a particular flexibility footnote. Section 120.50 permits the use of footnotes that allow agencies to increase their spending authority from offsetting collections or recoveries without resubmitting an apportionment. Here's an example from the Food and Drug Administration. The total amount apportioned may be increased for additional spending authority from offsetting collections received by an amount not to exceed 10% of the sum of such amounts identified in the calculation of total budgetary resources available. The amount of such increase is to be applied to the appropriate line in the application of budgetary resources. Note that OMB cautions you to include the yes in the line split column of the adjustment authority provided row if this authority is used. There's another circumstance where you may not have to submit an apportionment, and that is during a continuing resolution. During a continuing resolution, OMB issues a bulletin which automatically apportions funds appropriated under the CR. This bulletin apportions funds at the percentage of the year covered by the CR. Once the CR ends and a full year appropriation is enacted, Section 120.41 automatically apportions funds pending OMB's approval of the agency's apportionment request. This section apportions an additional 30 calendar days at the enacted appropriation level. If OMB has not approved a request after this time, another 30 days is automatically apportioned. There are a couple of caveats. Any footnotes or conditions placed on a prior year apportionment remain in effect under this authority. And you cannot start any new programs under this automatic authority. That would have to wait for a signed apportionment. I should also point out that if you do not submit your initial apportionment to OMB within the 30-day automatic apportionment period, you will have to provide an explanation of the delay to OMB. This requirement also applies to apportionments due by August 21 for those accounts with resources that are not dependent on appropriation acts, like carryover, user fees, permanent appropriations, and the like. As discussed in Module 1, you cannot obligate funds unless they're apportioned by OMB. So you should always keep in mind that you should do everything possible to facilitate approval of apportionments. That means you need to follow the proper OMB Circular A11 guidelines. You should accomplish the apportionments in a timely and accurate manner, and you should provide adequate justification to speed approval. This concludes Module 3. In this module, we have discussed what I refer to as the rest of the apportionment. That is, that portion of the apportionment package that supports the SF-132, such as footnotes and supporting documentation. I hope that by now you have a pretty good understanding of what's required in a complete apportionment package. In addition, we have discussed some circumstances that do not require submission of a reapportionment request, including how the apportionment request is affected during and immediately after a continuing resolution. Thanks for listening. Good luck.